Right, thank you so much for joining us early in the morning. You are in your 5th year in Russia. Tell me a little bit about your life.
I'm still in my 4th.
You're still in your 4th?
Soon.
Soon.
It'll be.
Okay, sorry about that.
Okay.
What is your life like now? What is your primary interest, and what is it like living in Moscow?
The work for reform is the primary part of my life now. Everybody asks sort of how are things in Russia, but the reality is I live a much more global life than that, as we see today. My day-to-day involves working with organizations across borders that don't really see lines and flags so much as they see the core issues. Now I work as the Freedom of the Press Foundation's president. And we're working on technical programs, technical projects, to make sure that journalists can do the kind of very difficult and confidential investigations that are needed to get the truth about programs they have a very high public impact, but at the same time, governments around the world, whether that is the US government, the Japanese government, the Chinese government, the Russian government, or any other, they don't feel a sense of responsibility in telling the public what they're actually doing.
Right. So you are trying to encourage journalists to work on difficult issues when there is a major gap between information between what the authorities can gather and what the public or the journalists can gather.
Yes, this is exactly the central issue. Throughout history, we've defined what the government should be and what the public should be quite differently. When we talk about ordinary people, members of the public, we don't say that they're public citizens. We say they're private citizens. The government is supposed to know very little about ordinary people unless they are actively criminals, unless they've gone to a court or a judge. The police have this specific person under investigation. And at the same time, we're supposed to know a very great deal about what our government representatives are doing, which is why we call them public officials. Excuse me. But we don't really hear that kind of language so much anymore. And governments seem to be actively campaigning to prevent that. We've had in Japan, just in the last year, questions raised about the Japanese government's involvement in US surveillance projects and technologies. And when evidence of this came in the newspapers through Japanese outlets and The Intercept, Japanese journalists approached the government, the ministers, people like Yoshihide Suga-san, and they asked, what does this mean? Are you doing this? Is this correct? And the Japanese government wouldn't even say yes or no. Instead, they tried to avoid answering the question entirely by instead saying, well, we don't know if these documents are authentic, which is, I think, disrespectful to the public, because the American government does not say these documents are inauthentic. The American government, where they originated from, accepts that these programs were unlawful in some cases, passed new legislation to change the way these programs operate, even though the reforms were very minimal. It wasn't enough, and the threat to rights is still very serious, even in the United States. But they were, at least they accepted, the US government accepted that when journalists had evidence, when the public had enough proof that these things were beyond the point of denying them reasonably, that these things were happening, that they would have that conversation. And I think it's unfortunate the Japanese government, and this is not unique to Japan, there are many governments that do this, but the Japanese government still objects and says we can't even discuss this because our allies wouldn't like it or because we don't know if it's true, when these are policies that have a primary public impact. They actually change not just the laws of a nation, but the culture of a nation. That shouldn't be a decision that's made by government. That should be a decision that's made by all of us collectively in public conversation.
I wonder if you feel that the Japanese press is not scrutinizing the government strongly enough.
I think it's understandable why in Japan this is not the case. The Japanese sort of media culture, people professionally who work at Japanese news organizations understand it's simply a reality that if they report too aggressively on the government's activities, even if the government is legitimately breaking the law, even if the government is legitimately engaged in some kind of scandal, that their editor will get a phone call, that there will be some pressure, that Japanese government officials will stop responding to the inquiries from that media organization and give preferential access to their competitors. And this is an intentional strategic dynamic on the part of the Japanese government, I think, to create a result from the Japanese media, which we see today. I think it's difficult to blame any particular Japanese media organization for this outcome. But I do think we can recognize that it's a very serious situation that needs a remedy. I don't believe it is okay to accept that this is simply the way things are, that the government will threaten the media out of reporting stories, not directly, but by structuring a system in which doing your job too well is punished. And unfortunately, I think the only way to change this is for the Japanese media collectively, all of the outlets, regardless of whether they are the most serious rivals or the closest partners, have to recognize that it is important for their future as an industry that the public see them as public champions. And that's only going to happen if they protect not only their own outlets, but the other outlets around them, to make sure their number one goal is always to find the truth, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's difficult for very powerful figures, politically or corporately, and get that to the public. It has to be a team sport.